Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'll just jump right in. What I'm about to read is a short section from the prologue to the book. The first reports of the murder were vague. A young anti-poverty worker had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered in the mountains of North Carolina, her body discovered almost within sight of the Appalachian Trail. Although the brutal and sexually charged details were downplayed, they would come out soon enough. The woman's college yearbook photo, her life and work, and the circumstances of her death were sketched out across the front page of the Durham Morning Sun on June 18, 1970. Authorities had no suspects. I read the article in the office of the Duke University newspaper, The Chronicle, where I spent, and some might say squandered, much of my 5 years as an undergraduate at Duke. By mid-June, the campus was finally quiet after days of rancorous upheaval. Protests in the wake of the National Guard killings of students at Kent State University, the invasion of Cambodia 6 weeks earlier, and the shooting of African-American students at Jackson State University in Mississippi had ended the school year at Duke. With classes and exams canceled and the semester abruptly over, most of the students trickled home. I learned from the Durham Sun that the murder victim was Nancy Dean Morgan, just 24, a recent graduate of Southern Illinois University, where she had majored in social welfare. A community organizer for the Volunteers in Service to America, known as Vista, she worked with children and helped set up a thrift shop that sold used clothing. Her service was to have ended only a few more weeks after this time, as she had planned to attend nursing school in New York in the fall. She'd be back, she had promised her friends, back with even more skills to help and maybe to stay. In the song Ohio, Neil Young's song about the Kent State killings, Crosby, Stills, and Nash asked what each of us would have done had we found one of the shooting victims. I didn't know Nancy, and I didn't find her in that mountain glade, but I remember feeling as though I had. She was a gifted generational avatar, shaped and transformed by the civil rights and anti-war movements, feminism, and the fight against poverty. She had been drawn by and killed in my adopted state. I had friends serving elsewhere in Vista, so maybe my connection to the killing was a throwback to the old Wobblies slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all. Thank you.
Well, Mark, you never fail to deliver, and to get a reference to the Wobblies in there, I mean, what more could we ask for?
It's in my blood.
I know that that's true. It's one of your many incredible elements to your career and your life. Let me just ask you a little bit about what was the context? What was 1970 like? You and I have talked before, and we used a term called unreconstructed, that there were parts of the country that really had resisted the reconstruction efforts after the Civil War and remained defiant, angrily defiant, but that there were larger forces at work that really shaped the context for Nancy Morgan. What were those?
Well, we were at a point where the nation was becoming increasingly divided. We thought it couldn't get any more divided, but as we know, history has proved us wrong on that score. And there was real division. The civil rights movement was still in full sway, still trying to reach places that it hadn't reached before. It had been joined by the anti-war movement once Martin Luther King joined them and said, these are really similar issues that involve the same things, that the efforts that the United States had to perfect itself, if possible, and those who resisted that perfection, and those who thought the United States should be a policeman for the world. And many of us didn't agree. And there was a real division throughout the country. And this was the context. And then the flashpoint was the invasion of Cambodia. And that set campuses ablaze. And it led to the killings at Kent State and Jackson State. And that had reverberations all across the country on campuses and outside of campuses. And it was particularly true in North Carolina and on the Duke campus where I was at that time.
When we think about places like Madison County or other areas of the South, and not just the South, but Midwest, there are places all around the country that resisted the reforms, the call to racial justice and the rights of women, indigenous rights, rights of workers. How were you shaped by that call? Those calls, because I think your story is woven in here as well and really shaped how you approached Nancy's murder.
Well, I was raised in a middle-class home in southern Jersey, in the suburbs, more or less liberal, but not politically active at all. And like many of my cohort, when I physically left the confines of my suburb and sort of uprooted from that cloth, that clothing, and I went to Durham, where I had never really been before, and world events and national events became localized. On the campus, we became very politicized. We cared about civil rights. This was the South. Durham was not Mississippi. I won't say that, but I think I was almost from when I set foot on the campus, I became engaged in civil rights. And then the anti-war movement came along, and I saw the connection there once it was kind of helpfully pointed out to me by Martin Luther King and others. And I had, the first serious romantic relationship, and nothing was without politics in those days. And so the politics of relationships was front and center. And my friends and their partners, the partners started first. The women began some of the early conscience raising groups. And it wasn't too long before they thought, well, we need to bring the male partners in because they've got a lot of work to do. So rather than coming home and doing it on an individual basis, they suggested that the partners of the women in the group form a men's group and begin to confront these issues. So politics was personal. The political, was personal. And so we were concerned about these events around the world, events around the country, events in our own campus area in Durham, and frankly, in our own personal relationships with our partners.
So what was the Vista program and how did it fit into those reform efforts? And why was Madison County one of the areas for the Vista program where Nancy was going to work?
Well, Vista was conceived of as the shorthand was the Domestic Peace Corps. But whereas people who went abroad for the Peace Corps made a commitment for 2 years, in Vista, the commitment was for 1 year. And the notion was, as we are sending our young people abroad to help people who are facing poverty and other challenges, we have plenty of problems here. That was recognized in the beginning. So the notion was these young people would be trained. They would go to urban centers where there was poverty and discrimination. They would go to Native American reservations. They would go to migrant camps, and they would go to rural areas where people had been isolated from many of the economic advances of the last 20 or 30 years. So one of the primary focuses was economic inequality and what would be the best way in each different context. There was not one size fit all. What could we as a generation do to reduce that economic disparity and the powerlessness that these people in white rural areas, in African American and people of color areas in cities, Native American reservations, and migrant workers camp, where could we address the serious problems that were facing America at that time?
So Nancy goes there, and it was a real time of tremendous idealism. I mean, I would think if you're in Vista, there had to be a great sense of mission, belief in change, deep respect for the suffering that other people or the privations or the needs that they have. What did you find? What do you think Nancy found when she went to Madison County?
Well, Nancy was a military brat. Her father was a colonel in the Air Force, career colonel, also an attorney. He worked in the Judge Advocate General's Corps when he was in the service. Around the time that she went to Madison County, he retired. He went to work on the faculty of the LSU, Louisiana State University Law School. She was raised in a fairly sheltered middle-class life. Now, there was a time when she lived in Germany when her father was stationed there, when she saw different things. She saw, how life was in Europe, but also her father handled many national security cases. And as she told her brothers and others, frequently high-level CIA people sat at their dinner table. So the conversation about world events was at a fairly high level, but this was in the abstract. Then the family moved to Northern Virginia. Her father was transferred to the Pentagon, and she was there at the time of John F. Kennedy's assassination and also Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Both of those affected her very, very deeply, as it did many people in that cohort. And she was kind of a spiritual seeker as well. So she was raised in a sort of Protestant, white bread home. But in this period of her seeking, she began attending different houses of worship to see if there was some explanation for the turmoil and the privation as she watched the civil rights movement unfolding on her television set. Her parents were from Louisiana, but she recalled they were not particularly racist, but they were not particularly progressive on the race issue. And so she was in Northern Virginia, which is a fairly cosmopolitan area, and she was affected by world events at the same time she was beginning to question. So she first went to a small college in Western Virginia, a teacher's college, and she began becoming interested in social work and how to bring about social change. When her father was transferred to St. Louis, Air Base there, she transferred to Southern Illinois University. She changed her major. She changed her major to social welfare, social work, but she also began taking courses in Latin American history and politics. And gradually, she was becoming more and more politically conscious. Unfortunately, she had a relationship that did not end well, and she was pregnant, and she needed an abortion. And so she traveled to Chicago to get an abortion. And that was a fairly traumatic event in her life. But all of the strands of social change that were swirling around America, North America, she was plugged into either by her studies or her personal experience. And I think she became more and more politicized. So by the time she finished at Southern Illinois University, instead of going on to nursing school, which she had talked about, she decided she needed to do something, to take a break, but to put her politics in the abstract into action, into concrete action. And that's why she joined Vista.
So did she have a choice of where she was going to go, or how
No.
did she arrive there, and what did she find?
Well, the Vistas couldn't choose their location. And of the contingent that ended up in Madison County, some really wanted somewhere else. Some wanted a migrant worker camp. One wanted to work on a Native American reservation, but you didn't have a choice. And so it came to this group of 8 young people to be assigned to Madison County and to go for 2 weeks of orientation and training in Atlanta, which in retrospect was nowhere near enough, because these young people were not only traveling to a different place geographically, in many places it was, you mentioned unreconstructed. In many cases, it was just almost a time capsule. It was a place in time of earlier decades. And it was a poor county, small county, 17,000 people up in the mountains, right on the Tennessee border, a beautiful place, geographically beautiful, but a sort of hard scrabble place where people really needed to struggle just to make enough money to survive the winter.
Well, I don't want to give too much away and no spoilers, but we do know that she met a really brutal and horrible end there. And I wonder, how did you go about piecing together what happened? Because it's not it was a lot, there were many years between your discovery or your reading the newspaper clipping you found about of her death, her murder, and then you never forgot it, even though you were reporting and you were freelancing and you were traveling. And so how did you manage to bring yourself full circle to piece together her story, and who talked to you and who wouldn't talk to you?
In the interim, from when I first read the article until I began my journalism career, I sort of angled into a specialty involving racial injustice. And that took me to many courtrooms, and I learned how to cover murder cases. I learned how to investigate murder cases, both contemporary murder cases and older murder cases. With older murder cases, I developed a procedure where you start with what is available in print. So what you look for is if there are any legal documents from that period, you would get them and read them. Next, you would try to find out whether there were any contemporary reporting at the time and find those newspaper clips and read those newspaper clips. I likened the paper record to the skeleton, and the articles, the contemporaneous reporting, as the muscles. And then you're, in my case, that's when I was ready to begin more serious reporting and actually making site visits up to Madison County. And because I didn't have a contract, I could take as long as I felt I needed to do the research. So when I went up to Madison County, I had an old friend from Duke who had an inn called Sunnybank Inn, Elmer Hall, and he was my base. He was in Madison County. He wasn't there at the time of the murder, but he arrived shortly thereafter. And I made a list of people from the clippings and the legal documents who I wanted to speak with. And I organized those names by who was closest to what happened, who knew the most, but also who was the oldest by that time. We're now talking about 20 years to 25 years after the murder occurred. So I knew I needed to get to the oldest people first, who had the best knowledge. And so I would come up a week in the spring and a week in the autumn from my home in the Central Florida suburbs. I wouldn't tell anyone but Elmer that I was coming. After all, it was an unsolved murder. And I would have a master list. And each time I would arrive, usually on a Sunday, I begin making phone calls from that list and see who was alive, who would speak with me, and who seemed clear-eyed enough. Or, people get up into the 80s, and above, the veil of Alzheimer's happens, dementia happens. And so I needed to find people, A, who would speak with me, B, who knew what happened, and although I didn't know this until I spoke with them, who would be most likely to tell me the unvarnished truth.
So I want to encourage our audience to please post questions in the chat if you have a question for Mark, or you can also send an email to virtualqa@malaprops.com, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And we want to let you know, Mark, I've already got a great comment from someone who has said they really appreciated how well written the book was. They picked it up out of general interest, but really what they found was such a well-written and compelling story. It really transcended just their basic interest in the story in the region. So great praise, and highly recommended I highly recommend it is the final sentence there. So as do I certainly do. So I am curious, and how do you know, some people call it the BS detector. How do you know when someone's lying to you?
Well, there's a Latin expression called cui bono, which is who benefits. And when you go to see someone, you think, what is their interest in their participation? What do they stand to gain from what they tell you? And also, what role did they likely play in the story? If they were potentially culpable in the murder or in the investigation, it's in their interest not to tell you too much. If they were in a truth seeking, like a journalist, they have nothing to hide. So if they have nothing to hide, they can be frank. This issue was complicated because it's not just the story of Nancy Morgan's murder, but it's also the story of the Ponder political machine and how those two things interacted. And when I first began going up there, I guess in '93, my first visit in 1978, but seriously in around the middle of the 1990s, there were people, even though the Ponders were out of power, who any question you asked involving the Ponders, people hesitated before they would decide whether to say anything and how much of what they knew, how much of the truth they would tell you. There was one former prosecutor who was very generous in his time. He invited me out to his home. His wife was with him. They served me fresh pressed cider, and they seemed very open. And but whenever I asked the husband, the former prosecutor, about the Ponders, I noticed that the wife gently put her hand on her husband's forearm as a signal not to talk about that particular issue. And then in the longer term, as the years passed, the more you know about what really happened, the more you can evaluate what people tell you about their role in what happened. So, and oftentimes people who don't have a vested interest, if you demonstrate to them that you're prepared and you know a lot, they'll say, well, then if you know that much, I'll tell you this much more. And that's not confined to Matter on the Mountain. That's my whole adult life as a reporter.
Have you, in your body of work, and particularly in this book, I was listening to something today, and they were talking about the inherent tragedy of life because of contradictions.
Right.
That's one of the things that's so difficult to deal with, is that there's nuance, there's complication, and that's the inherent tragedy of being a human being. You've covered a lot of murder trials, and Jeffrey McDonald, the murder of his wife and two children there, here in North Carolina, military base Camp Lejeune.
Fort Bragg.
Fort Bragg, and I already mentioned Ted Bundy, Trayvon Martin. What have you been able to draw any conclusions about humankind and what makes us tick?
I think you're exactly right. Life is complicated, and very rarely do you encounter pure evil, unadulterated evil. And I would put Ted Bundy in that category. I would put Jeffrey McDonald in that category. But I covered enough murder cases to know that TV and movies and mysteries notwithstanding, there are very few criminal masterminds. Crime, particularly violent crime, particularly murder, they tend to well up suddenly. They're rarely well planned out effects. And oftentimes there's a sort of, if in retrospect, you can see that things were getting worse in this person's life and worse and worse and worse until finally there was a psychotic episode or something set them off and they did, a really horrible thing. But, very few people set out to do very bad things. But, life happens, and it buffets you sometimes, and you find yourself sometimes having to make choices that you wish you didn't have to make. And in retrospect, maybe they weren't the right choices. And, in hurting people, maybe not physically, but hurting people emotionally and disregarding their feelings. It's just, life gets complicated, it speeds up, and you're not always paying attention as much as you really ought to be paying attention. And that's when bad things can happen.
I think, I can see that it's easy to get immersed in something and then really miss what's going on right in front of you sometimes. Now one of my kitty cats, speaking of things that are just joining you, it's like the cats know, oh, it's Zoom, it's time. That was Pearl. I think you met Pearl before.
Yes.
So when I'm thinking about the machine, the political machine, the Ponder political machine, what comes to mind to me are sort of the Tammany Hall, the others like the Chicago machine, these political organizations where money changes hand, a cadre of men, usually white men, usually have the influence. They trade kind of favors, and it's sort of a sometimes people call it the good old boy club, but this is about politics and money. It's about power. So sometimes a book is about world building, and mostly we say that in connection to things like science fiction, but you really had to do some world building in your book of Madison County and the Ponder machine. How did you piece together that Ponder political machine?
Well, I was always interested in politics, particularly in Civil War, but mostly post-Civil War politics in the South, and that hopeful moment that was Reconstruction, et cetera. And I was intrigued by Madison County's Civil War history. The county was divided almost equally between Democrats and Republicans, secessionists and unionists, and the city people and the country people. And so it was really, the Civil War in Madison County was almost a class struggle battle. And it was, as happens in civil wars, it gets very personal and gets very, very ugly. And what impressed me, or what drew me, was how the roots of Nancy Morgan's murder, the roots of the Ponder machine, stretch all the way back to the Civil War. And the people on both sides of the Ponders were Democrats, but they took over after 100 years of Republican rule. And the rule for a successful political machine, be it Tammany Hall or Richard Daley's in Chicago, is those who want power and who hold power, in order to maintain the power, have to deliver for their constituents. And so Madison County, being so poor and so isolated, with little in the way of industry, I think there was like one glove factory there. In terms of agriculture, there was tobacco, tomatoes, and some corn. And that was pretty much it. And the winters are awfully cold. And so there were very few jobs. So the only jobs in the county that were reliable were teaching in the school system, and working on the highway crews. So the Ponders understood that instinctively after World War II. They mobilized veterans to take over for the Democrats, and they began extracting roads from the state government in Raleigh, which was also Democratic. And they had a sort of flexible notice of how votes would be counted, which is to say, in the old days, when North Carolina was a Democratic state, what determined who would win would be who won the Democratic primary, particularly in statewide races for governor and senator. And by garnering all this loyalty and these votes and being in control of the machinery, late nights on primary nights, oftentimes a candidate would call and say, this is how many votes we need to win the statewide race. And sure enough, when the totals came in from Madison County, they were just enough to push over the governor's race. And so that was a big chit. I mean, that candidate owed big time the Madison County machine. And so farm to market roads began coming in, and they benefited many people. And then in the 70s, under the Nixon administration, picking up on the Johnson administration, there was the war on poverty. There were all these programs to help people, really help people, and put money in people's pockets, give them jobs that the federal government would pay for. And pretty much every federal program that was on offer in the 70s, in the war on poverty, the Ponder machine made sure Madison County got its share, and sometimes more than its share. And things were so dire in Madison County that it was important for you, if you could get a job driving a school bus for $50 a month, that $50 a month could make the difference between you, whether your family were hungry during the winter or not hungry. And the Ponders were very good at this. And because they continued to deliver roads and jobs and federal programs, the people kept voting for the Ponders. And the Ponders then used those votes, traded those votes with the Democrats in Raleigh to get state programs. So there were federal programs and money coming in and state money and programs coming in. Now, it didn't change the fundamental economic base of Madison County, but it made life better, and it made life palpably better, and people understood that. And so that's why the Ponders remain in such power. And on a local level, one of the offices that one of the Ponder brothers held was sheriff. Well, in a county like Madison County, if there's a death, the sheriff goes out. They weren't big enough to have their own coroner. So the sheriff would come out to the scene of a death. And it was the sheriff's decision whether it was homicide, whether it was suicide, whether it was accidental death, or one of those things. And that decision would be of momentous importance to that family. It would mean, did a member of their family face the death penalty? Did a member of their family face a long time in prison? Did members of their family have to borrow money, sell their cows to pay a lawyer to defend themselves? So when the sheriff would come out in a questionable case that might have been murder and called it suicide or death by accident, the members of that family owe the sheriff for life. And anything that the sheriff wanted from them, and that later transmitted, I learned, when not just for votes or contributions to the Democratic Party, but if there was a politically sensitive criminal case or civil case, and a member of this family was placed on the jury, they knew what side they should be on when the jury went back into the jury room. And this is an incredible amount of power on a very local level.
Well, that leads me to a question about the sheriff and about the State Bureau of Investigation. Kelly says, I read your book and loved it. 3 exclamation points at the end of that. Do you have contacts with the sheriff's office and SBI who keep you up to date on their progress?
That's a complicated question, but a fairly simple answer. They have not wanted my advice, which is typical of law enforcement. The initial investigation in 1970 was a mess. The State Bureau of Investigation did not do a good job. The SBI did not want to cooperate with the book. And in our new edition, the one that's just come out, there's a new chapter at the end wherein people who were friends of Nancy's or up in Madison County read about this new forensic technique called genetic genealogy, which uses DNA. It first solved the Golden State Killer several years ago by using what's called collateral DNA with people who sign up for Ancestry.com or 23andMe, and comparing those samples with the DNA found at the murder site, and trying to find people who maybe didn't commit the murder, but who had the same names, the same distinctive names as people who are initially considered suspects. So I thought this is a legitimate question. So I contacted the SBI and I contacted the Madison County Sheriff's Office, and they basically blew me off. They didn't pay any attention to what I wanted. They didn't. In the case of the Sheriff's Office, they didn't even answer me. I sent a politely worded Facebook message. I sent an email to the Sheriff's Department. I even dropped by the Sheriff's Office and left a note and got nothing in return. Now, as it happens, last night, I was giving a reading and discussion at the Madison County Library in Marshall. And we had a pretty good crowd, and we talked about the case. And a lot of those people knew a lot about the case. But by coincidence, Sheriff Buddy Harwood was in the building at a budget meeting. And he came out of the budget meeting and he saw my name on the poster and he came into our session. And when I got to the point of my presentation where I said, and I never heard from the sheriff raises his hand and said, well, this is an ongoing investigation. And that's why we never got back to you. We are pursuing this and we are going to do this and we are going to do that. And it also was not coincidental that the sheriff is up for re-election this year. But at least I was able to get a direct answer from law enforcement because using genetic genealogy is not complicated. It's not all that expensive. And ever since it was used for the Golden State Killer, you can't go onto the web or open a newspaper without reading about a cold case solved in Canada or in Arizona, or all over the place, because it's so simple and not labor intensive. And it seemed to me it was a no-brainer. Why don't they use it here? And he said, well, we're following this lead and that lead, and we went to Washington. And he was never completely clear. And he said, and it's an ongoing investigation, so I can't share with you where we are, which is standard procedure when law enforcement doesn't really want to tell you what they're up to. Fair enough, but at least this book now has given us the opportunity to put the question directly to Sheriff Harwood. And I have hopes. I mean, he may do this, and he said he was committed to solving this murder. And I should say that people running for sheriff in Madison County since the murder took place have campaigned on the notice that if you elect me, I'll solve the Nancy Morgan murder. At least 4 sheriffs have run on that. And so far, no one has delivered on that promise.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned the new chapter and this genealogical DNA, because your book really is a part of that true crime renaissance. I, as someone who really has enjoyed that, I enjoy that genre, but I also enjoy the justice angle of it, as well as seeking of justice. And I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara about the Golden State Killers. Such an important book. That yours is really, I see them alongside each other, is that and needing to find people who are willing to cooperate, who are willing to tell the truth, even after decades. I mean, that's another thing that your book and that book that you have in common. What do you think about the genre of true crime now? And in your travels and your presentations as an author, what have you seen some things that you're interested in, or is there another crime out there that you might be interested in?
I think the thing I should say first, because whenever I speak, I try to tell people this. I know many people enjoy true crime, either on TV or in books or in movies, and I understand that. But I'm always ambivalent, because, to be perfectly honest with myself, I profit from other people's grave misfortunes, and I always try to keep the victims in mind. I don't cover these cases for entertainment. I mean, if I can't bring the search for justice to a case, I don't want to cover it. If I can't help bring justice, then I don't want to do it. So I choose my cases carefully. Sometimes the cases choose me, and that happens. And it happened a lot in the 1970s with, racial justice cases. I really had a burning heart for racial justice, and that drew me to these murder cases mostly in North Carolina, but around the Southeast as well. And then, as I say, I developed a reputation covering cases where the defendants were poor Black and innocent. And I got so good at it, I ended up reporting on cases where they were wealthy, white, and guilty, which was not why I got into the business, but if it comes to you, it comes to you. And so I always try to keep the victims in mind. And I always try to pick cases where I can participate. I don't like to just report or analyze. I like to be a part of the process. My late mother, rest in peace, was always on me. In the 70s, she said, well, if you like being in court so much, why didn't you go to law school like your mom, like your dad and I wanted you to do? I said, that's not
And
the
the
way
answer
the deal
is,
goes.
what's
Well,
the
the
answer?
answer is actually simpler than you would think. The cases that I covered were often the most important cases that an individual attorney played in. And many of them thought, well, this is the big case. I'm going to have a big case from now on. And most of them, this was the only case that they ever had like that. Whereas by doing what I did, I could go from important, exciting case to important, exciting case and not wait for them to come through the doors of my law office. And I was in a hurry too, like a lot of us.
You're in a hurry. You were freelancers. You've got to keep on the move, right?
Right. I started out, I guess, in the early 70s. I was working. I was getting paid 10 cents a word published, and sometimes I would be running to the mailbox every day to see if a check had arrived. So I worked in a bookstore to support myself. I worked at the Intimate bookstore in Chapel Hill that Wallace Carroll ran. I worked in a lumber yard. I did all sorts of things to support my writing habit until I began earning enough money that I could just write for a living.
And thank goodness you did. Now, Kelly has a follow-up question. Why haven't they tested the DNA?
Well, they have the DNA, surprisingly, because it was 1970. It was really the early years of DNA. And they say they have preserved it. And I went to the lab in Chapel Hill. The medical examiner showed me the sample that they still have it. The thing is that this gets a little unpleasant and clinical, but when Nancy Morgan was kidnapped and raped, there was physical evidence of more than one person in the DNA. And so they had to find the people to test the DNA against. And what we later learned, there was a big scandal in North Carolina in 2010 because the state criminal lab under the SBI was making many mistakes and cooking the books. And so the criminal lab was taken away from the SBI and turned over to the State Department of Justice. And so there was the question of who do you test the DNA that you have against? Because you can't force someone to take a DNA test. Now, if they're in the prison system, they do have to provide a DNA sample. If they're in the military, they have to provide a DNA sample. And in some cases, some jobs require it, but it wasn't universal by any stretch of the imagination. And there was one person who the SBI was convinced had done this murder. And the sheriff, I think, helped frame this person. But even with the frame, this person was acquitted in 45 minutes. An outsider from Florida was acquitted by a Madison County jury in, sorry.
That's okay.
And he was acquitted, but the SBI insisted he was really the person. They wanted to test the DNA they had against him, but he was so angry at how he was treated by the judicial system, he said, okay, I'll provide a DNA sample for comparison, but I won't let the SBI do the comparison. If you can find me an independent lab that is acceptable to the SBI and to me, I'll provide a sample. And so I contacted a very prominent lawyer in Asheville, Sean Devereaux, who was my Duke classmate. And he came up with a couple labs that had done this before in other cases. And when I went back to the SBI, they said, oh, we changed our minds. We're not going to deal with any outside laboratories. And so that opportunity went away. And over time, the person who they thought did it said, I'm done with these people. I'm not providing any samples at all. Now, that's why the genetic genealogy is so attractive, because you don't have to ask people for samples. You basically go to 23andMe, you go to Ancestry.com and some of these places, and you say, here's a sample. Can you show me, do you have any people who are consistent, not identical, but persistent, but consistent? So you look for a name of one of the 5 or 6 or 7 people who I've identified as people who I believe were involved in it. And do we have any relatives in the area who would lead us back to these original suspects? Once you get that, Then you can go to the suspects or go to closer relatives if the suspects have died, which has happened in this case, and get a pretty good idea if that was the person who was connected to the DNA found in Nancy Morgan's body.
Well, we have about 10 more minutes left, and I would love to ask you about your book that's coming out here next month, Drifting into Darkness, Murder, Madness, Suicide, and a Death. And this is in quotes, under suspicious circumstances. So this is set in Montgomery, Alabama. And then, of course, we've got Boulder and then, Wyoming. So give us a little taste, if you could, Mark.
Okay, there's a direct connection. When Men on the Mountain first came out, the first edition in 2013, I got a call from my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, who is an attorney and a social worker. And she said, I just read your book and I have a case I need you to write a book about. And her specialty is called death penalty mitigation, which means she works with defense teams to save people who may be guilty, but to save them from the death penalty. So she prepares a report about their lives, apart from whether they did it or didn't do it, but to convince a judge, a prosecutor, or a penalty phase jury that don't kill this person. They never did anything wrong. They were abused, whatever it was. And she had covered a case where she felt there was a miscarriage of justice. She was able to save a young man from death row for killing both his parents with an axe handle. But she felt that this young man had been manipulated by a woman who claimed to be a Native American shaman. And that she basically had this young man under her spell. And it was she was the one who got this young man to kill his parents to get a great deal of money. And my sister-in-law was so outraged that the young man who she saved from death row, but later committed suicide in prison, was still so under her sway, he wouldn't roll on her. He wouldn't. And so my sister-in-law felt that this woman got away with murder. And she said, you have to write a book that will give this woman the trial she escaped from. And that's why I got into it. And so, it begins with a horrible double parricide, this young man beating to death his parents with an axe handle in their home in Montgomery. And the story spools back from that. So that's how we got from one book to another. Now, normally the murder, which such a brutal murder, I probably wouldn't have covered. If my sister-in-law hadn't put the arm on me, I probably wouldn't have written this book. But the book then unspooled in a way that was really incredibly fascinating. I think readers of true crime will really be engaged because I take you, in addition to taking you with me while I try to solve what happened, because of the material that my sister-in-law gave me, I take you inside the minds of the young man who killed his parents. I take you inside the minds of his parents because they wrote letters. They wrote journals, they wrote emails, all of which my sister-in-law gave me. So when I say this person thought this at the time, it's not like I'm saying must have thought or probably thought. I know what they were thinking. So I can take the reader with me inside these troubled minds.
That's really rare in nonfiction to have that kind of access and those kinds of materials, journals, and letters, because the hypotheticals for me, I find them distressing, and that I don't like to kind of guess they must have, could they have. They certainly, it's much better to be able to bring the reader, and you as a journalist, I know, appreciate this. It's the facts. It's not the speculation that drives you.
And also, I should have mentioned that my sister-in-law was able to turn over to me the young man's psychiatric records. He had seen 4 psychiatrists and had been involuntarily committed for observation. And under the HIPAA regulations, those medical records are impossible for journalists to get without the person who's the patient giving it. And I had a stack of psychiatric records for this troubled young man that stood 1.5 feet off the ground. And so I could literally tell you what the psychiatrist was thinking about their diagnosis. it was an opportunity, even though it wasn't my kind of case, a political case, a racial case. It was so rich in the material, the interior material, that set me off. And once I spent the first 6 months going over that material, then it's my job. Then I began to go to Montgomery and in interviewing people and getting documents and doing all this other kind of stuff.
What are some of your takeaways about how the legal system operates in criminal cases? Now, states vary, and it depends upon the time in which we're talking about and the political machine that we've already mentioned that's in place, and those still exist today. I mean, they're not artifacts; they still exist. So, what are your takeaways as a student of the political process and going back decades? What do you want us to know about the legal system?
Well, back in the 60s, we used to say the golden rule is the people who have the gold make the rule. And I think that's true. It's true today, less so maybe today, but in the fundamental analysis, not true. As far as capital punishment goes, we used to say those without the capital get the punishment. And I think that's probably still true. If you look at the demographics of death row, you'll see who suffers the most from the legal system, and class and money basically still play a large role in how the criminal justice system operates. And I wish it weren't true. It may be less true today. I'm not prepared to say, but it's still a factor, and it's still a big factor. Money is always a big factor in how justice is meted out.
Well, we are coming to the top of the hour, but I wonder, now this is an author event that's very special because it's about 2 books. So is it just pushing it a little too far to ask you what's next?
Well, I have to say, when I talked about the importance of money, I guess it depends on how well these books do. I mean, if either or both of these books do well, I'm likely to have the opportunity to take, I'm 75 years old, so I have an eye on the clock. But if either of them do well, it might offer me an opportunity to do maybe one more book about crime and criminal justice. So it's up to you out there.
The audience, I think we've been given our directions, right, on what to do. I heard somebody talking about I.F. Stone today, and you mentioned turning down an opportunity to work for I.F. Stone when you were a young freelancer, or maybe you were in college, right, or making a choice about
I just
where to
been
go.
fired by the Associated Press.
Right.
I got arrested during the May Day demonstrations in Washington.
That's right.
And I question that decision to this day. I wonder how my life might have been different if I'd accepted that offer. I spent the whole day walking around Washington with him, and I was just entranced. Everything they say about him is true. He was a giant, and I probably made the wrong decision.
Well, I mean, I would love a book that you'd write about him and about kind of that whole milieu which you operated in as a young man, as a journalist in those times.
There's a wonderful documentary about him, very, very well done. It's just called I.F. Stone's Weekly, and I think late journalist Nat Hentop narrates it. It captures him in all his charm and dedication.
Well, are there any books besides your own that influenced you or shaped you, and as you were growing up or as you were training as a journalist? If anybody kind of wants to get into the mind of Mark Pinsky and what formed him.
Well, the major crossover books that I would recommend, you start with In Cold Blood, Truman Capote's book. And later on in my career, as I was then doing kind of crime reporting, I covered the Bundy case and the Jeffrey McDonald case, there were two excellent books that came out of that. Ann Rule's The Stranger Beside Me about Bundy, and Joe McGinnis's book, Fatal Vision. They're really classics. Now, after I had written some of my own books, I read Tim Tyson's Blood Done Sign My Name, which is just a classic. And I have so much admiration for Tim. And it was a book about civil rights and racial justice, but he wove memoir, his own personal story through it. And I was very, very much influenced by that. So I would start with Blood Done Sign My Name, and then Fatal Vision, The Stranger Beside Me, and In Cold Blood.
Well, we also have to start with your books. Let me mention just the two that we have been talking about this evening. Met Her on the Mountain is the first book, a 40-year quest to solve the Appalachian cold case murder of Nancy Morgan. And we have signed copies of that available at Malaprops. And then coming out on May 24th, Drifting into Darkness, Murder, Madness, Suicide, and a Death Under Suspicious Circumstances. Well, I've had a rare treat. I've gotten to talk to you twice now, Mark, and every time you teach me something, and I know our audience is the better for it. Thank you for the road you took. I.F. Stone, hey, you took the better offer. So I'm glad you did. And it was a pleasure to talk to you this evening. Thank you for joining us on our Malaprops author event.
Well, Patricia, thank you very much. It's a joy to speak to another committed, informed person. There is a difference. There is a difference between those who are and those who aren't. And, it's always good to have a kindred spirit.
That we are. Thank you so much, audience. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. The link you used to watch this event tonight, you can come back to again if you want to rewatch it. It's a great interview. I love what Mark has to say. So you may have to come back and watch it again. Thank you all and good night.